Welcome. My name is Daniela Blechmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today for a conversation about this new book, Skin Theory, Visual Culture, and the Postwar Prison Laboratory by Cristina Visperas. If you are able to turn on your camera, we invite everyone to turn on the camera for this conversation. And thank you very much to our co-organizers for this book chat, the Institute for Diversity and Empowerment at Annenberg, and the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life at USC. Today, we are joined by Thuy Linh Nguyen Tu, who is professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University, and by Anthony Hatch, who is professor of science in society at Wesleyan University. And our moderator for the conversation is Nayan Shah, professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California. We will begin with a short introduction to the book by the author, and then she will engage in conversations with her invited interlocutors. And we will do that for about 35-40 minutes, and then we will have the last 20 minutes of the hour roughly for questions from the audience. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you especially to Professors Tu, Hatch, and Shah for participating. And of course, above all, congratulations and thank you to Cristina for this book, whose publication brings us together. So please tell us about it.
Thank you, Professor Blechmar, for inviting me to share my work at the Levan Institute, Dr. Zachman for helping to organize this book chat, and ID at Annenberg and STPL for co-sponsoring the event. I'm also really grateful to Professor Shah, Hatch, and Tu for engaging in my work, and for all of you in the audience for joining the discussion today. So I began research for the book during my graduate studies when I first came across abolition as a political theory and praxis. And one of the core dimensions of abolition that informed my thinking was its emphasis on looking beyond the concrete built environments of imprisonment to a wider culture of racialized punishment that does not respond to crime, but creates it. So from chattel slavery to the prison industrial complex, relegating certain people as always already outside of legal and moral definitions of innocence and bodily sovereignty. And I saw this framework as dovetailing into existing methodologies in science and technology studies, which approaches science as, among other things, a culture. So not something apart from or external to culture that is then positively or negatively influenced by prevailing attitudes. For example, how a racist culture would produce scientific racism. Instead, science, through its logic and situated practices, producing a culture. So combine these frameworks, ground the book's analysis of the visual culture of medical science studies conducted in US prisons during the post-war period, focusing on Albert Kligman's infamous skin experiments at Holmesburg Prison, Philadelphia, whose captive population at the time was made up predominantly of Black men. So to put it very briefly, the book analyzes the myriad and ambivalent role that skin played in Kligman studies and in how we remember those studies. So it looks at how Black skin became an apparatus, how it became an instrument for visualizing biochemical processes, or how Black skin then became the object of study in experiments on skin allergies, where researchers basically concluded that it's simply harder to see pain in Black skin. Skin as architecture. So interestingly enough, the largest and most accessible archive of Holmesburg Prison today is pop culture. movies, TV shows, blogs about ghost sightings, artists and amateur photographers, all remembering Kligman's experiments in unique ways that relocate skin from the imprisoned body to the physical structure of the prison. And finally, how did skin figure as discourse, the language of bioethics, which took the wounded subject of medical science as the catalyst for reformist solutions to the ethical problem of experimenting on captive populations. And I would say this was definitely the most difficult part to write in the book, because the Bioethics Commission was tasked with putting together guidelines for protecting vulnerable subjects, but then ultimately reproduced the exploitative practices of the scientists they were meant to regulate. So ultimately, the goal of the book was to map this punitive culture of race making across varied but linked objects and practices of representation and knowledge production at the intersections of science and incarceration. And in doing so, it avoids, or at least tried to avoid, defining scientific racism as instances of abuse and exploitation, that scientific racism is where science went wrong, for example. Instead, the book tried very seriously, or to take very seriously, a culture of science that is internal to racism.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for summing up the book in such an incredibly tight configuration. I mean, what's extraordinary about the book is that you exfoliate it in so many different directions. And I use that, I know, advisedly, but I really think it's important to think about how you reckon with the culture of science and the culture of imprisonment and the ways in which we think about culture more generally. And I want to first turn to Professor Anthony Hatch to raise some questions about the work.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Cristina, and to all who've joined in this conversation. I just want to say in one penny of a thought, this is a compelling and erudite, profoundly troubling, beautifully written book. It's evocative of the various objects that it takes up in ways that I found myself flagging and revisiting in my reading of it. So highly commended. Maybe my first question of the many that I could ask and that would maybe be inspired, you would be inspired to ask yourself is about this deep revisioning you're doing of this, you know, what I thought was maybe in some way a well-worn site of Holmesburg, right? And these you know, notorious experiments that were there, and you engage with and construct new archives for this site and for these bodies. So could you talk about and the kind of the process that you went through to think through and retell, re-narrate, revise, literally to bring into a different view, you know, these experiments. I mean, I literally find myself learning through the book, through your translation, through this didactic approach you took. So can you talk about like the site selection and excavation in a way that, you know, people who don't know would just be able to understand? It's so good. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for that question. Yes. So I was a graduate student, and I think one of the pressures that graduate students feel when they first start their project is, what is my archive? And I didn't have one. I tried to find Kligman's archive, and one historian told me, you're never gonna find it. And so, but I was still very much committed to the project. And so one, I had to let go of an archive that would give me what I want. This was difficult because in science and technology studies, I was trying to follow this tradition of lab studies where you go into the notebooks of researchers and figure out what exactly they did, because focusing on scientific publications is not going to give you a more accurate picture of what happened because scientific publications are cleaned up. They clean up all the mess. They didn't talk about all the things that they had to troubleshoot in the lab. So I had to give that up as a project. But what I also learned is that I should not invest a lot of explanatory power in the archive in the first place. And I think if Julietta Singh's book, The Archive Will, or No Archive Will Complete You, was published at the time, I think I would have felt a lot more comfortable doing the project I did. So I did end up, choosing objects that were there, the scientific publications, all the different ways that ghost stories or artists, amateur photographers try to document the prison space and the ways that they would gesture to Kligman's experiments. And I would say that the easiest archive for me to find, apart from the ones that I saw in pop culture, mass media, were bioethics. The first task force on bioethics, their communiques, their notes, their investigations, they were all well preserved and ordered at Georgetown. And so that was how I chose my sites. I went to the things that were there, and it made for a very, I would say, uncomfortable, weird book to write, because I would go from expert language, technical language about how experiments are created, to episodes about ghosts that appear in the now decommissioned prison of Holmesburg. So how can I talk about ghost stories alongside expert knowledge? And I think I had to lean really hard in my communication training for that one.
Yeah, you can tell. I'll just say quickly, and then I'll just in very quick response, you can tell that the assemblage that you put together of photographs and images in scientific journals, revisiting the well-worn and ordinary, was so effective throughout the book. Thank you.
Thanks. Turning now to Professor Thuy Linh Tu.
Well, thank you again so much for having me here, and Cristina, for this opportunity to talk about your beautiful book. I heard about it many, many years ago before it came out from Lin Nguyen, who's in the Zoom somewhere, and I've been excitedly waiting for it ever since. And having, the last comment you made about this kind of experience of writing this uncomfortable, weird book to write, I love that it is that discomfort and that weirdness really shows up in the book, because writing a book about skin is kind of weird, right? And I love that you went there, and I love what you are able to reveal, right, through this kind of hermeneutic of skin. And so my question, given that we have such a short amount of time, and I have many, is to ask you just to talk a little bit more about that skin. In the book, skin appears as a dialectic of visibility and invisibility, a kind of hermeneutic for you, such that it can allow you to move from literal skin to metaphorical skin, like the skin of architecture, the skin of words. And by the end, you kind of come around to this idea of thinking of skin as flesh rather than epidermis. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and about this point that you make about how skin evidences injury and non-subjectivity, which I think dovetails with your earlier comments about thinking about abolition, and really recognizing the different sites of injury, right, that we may not be recognizing. And then finally, related, skin is that sort of dividing structure that tells us we are we and they are they, but it's also that connective tissue. And I wonder if you wanted to say also a few words about how skin connects for you, just because it was less sort of forefronted in the book.
I guess I'll start there with the last comments, and thank you for the question about how skin connects, because I did feel that pressure to also theorize that, like, how is skin this medium that also allows for relationality and sociality, and but as you probably saw, the book doesn't offer that, because I was writing from a space where, since there were so many instances of violation that I was writing from, I had this sort of hesitancy to say something about connection, when it felt at the time for me to write something that, without rehashing neoliberal ideas about individuality and sovereignty, sort of putting boundaries around a body consistently under siege. And so connection sort of just fell out of the analysis when I was figuring that. And I guess I would say I'm doing a lot of trauma work right now, and I guess, to borrow the language around trauma, it's you can't really begin the work of healing and repair unless the subject is in a space of safety. And so I really couldn't bring the book to that space of, like, imagining in a substantive way safety and repair without first talking about the prison. It's still there. It's a book where I'm writing about a subject that I don't want to exist, the captive, right? And so I would say that's why the book is very much lacking in any kind of explanations of connection when it comes to skin. Now I seem to have lost the other part of the first parts of the question, since I started at the end, but I know that it's about skin again. Sorry.
Just the question about injury.
Oh, yes. Yes, so that's where I wanted to stay with, is injury, and not assuming that we know what it means. And so the book is about is about injury, and what we think we know about injury, what we think we see when we see injury, and oftentimes the unseeing of injury. And so this, I think, to point to Anthony's question again about revisiting a well-worn example of medical abuse, I wanted to move away from that framework of abuse and exploitation. And I realized that that was another way of explaining why I shouldn't put so much explanatory power on the archive. Because if I did have Kligman's archive, it's only gonna give me more examples of this abuse. It's only gonna clarify that even more. But it doesn't give me it doesn't give me an explanation why we shouldn't be surprised that Kligman's work was among many others, and that it followed this much longer history of exploiting captive populations in the United States. So skin, in my book, I wanted to look at how, not what it is per se, but what it's doing, but mostly, I think more accurately, how skin is being done, how all of these image makers and the technologies they use do or produce skin. And sometimes skin is just like another technology. It's a screen for showing us things that is not about skin at all, or it's not about the person who has that skin. And sometimes skin is a conceptual thing. It is And when it is conceptualized, it rehashes or reproduces. It becomes imbued with all of those neoliberal humanistic ideas about an agential, capacious subject, which is then not at all about the prisoner.
Thanks. That you're sort of really moving into the depths of these observations around skin and the ways in which you use it as a constant reflection of that technology, of also different ways in which visuality is so critical to your work. And I was just trying to think about that critical comment that you make about visuality throughout, about how you're trying to think through not just the epistemology of race on the skin, but also what the visual technologies keep on trying to produce and create, and what they disrupt. That's my comment, and I'm going to turn it to Anthony for a more in-depth question.
Your comment is right. Maybe for others too in the space is right, kind of in line with one of the questions I had, which is, and is to really draw attention to one of the core arguments in the book, which is that you theorize, quote, a common optical rationality between medical science and captivity. Right, a common optical rationality between medical science and captivity. That's on page 2. And then by the time I got all the way to the end, I was like, oh, wow. I really came together for me. So that's my question about this visual and the stakes. So if so much of our knowledge, biomedical and otherwise, is produced via the prison and imprisonment, like what does that mean for what we know or don't know about so-called free living subjects? Like, I mean, like so much. I mean, you're excavating one space and seeing one, but you mentioned we know there's so much we don't know about other sites, that don't have, that aren't featured in pop culture, like Holmesburg and like other prisons that are part of prison culture. So, can you speculate on what we can't see yet about this history of deep trauma vis-a-vis the prison, and like biomedicine has been built off that. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. But it's something that I struggle, like what are we looking at here when we're looking at a science in captive places in such a way that we don't isolate it as this like one-off, oh, this is an extreme form of science having gone wrong. I wanted to center it as, what is it about that term again, what is it about our culture that this can happen, that experiments on captive populations can happen, and it can happen over and over and over again? Or how issues of race is biologized over and over again. What is this repetition about? What is this attachment to race all about in the sciences? And that's what I was getting into, even if it is very much situated in this one small example. It's an optical rationality between prison and the sciences. That was one way where I felt like I could talk about this recurrence, this repetition. I was trying to make an argument about how not to then sort of pose a counterfactual, like, what if we didn't have science in prisons? Then would the visual culture be different, right? I didn't want that, because it had a way of, again, sort of making these experiments so situated, so historicized, that the structure, which is repetition, kind of falls by the wayside, is bracketed. So how so that was very much, I was trying to, what was I trying to say? I was trying to say that it is no accident that these experiments occurred in prisons, that prisons have a way of already de-individuating its subjects, one, and that is what demonstrative science in the lab does. It requires repetition. It requires de-individuated subjects because it requires standardization. So that also is what happens in prisons. You standardize people in a certain way. Another thing that prisons share is that with labs, I found, is that prisons are these uncompromisingly repetitive structures. You see hundreds of cells in a prison. The architecture itself does the work of de-individuation, and then it also is antisocial in that it keeps prisoners away from their families, from their communities, from wider societies. Nicole Fleetwood talked about this, how that affects visuality, that the rest of society doesn't have to see prisoners. And then that also sort of constrains the way prisoners see themselves and their relationship to society. And the lab, I saw that sort of happening in the lab also, where good science means controlling for variables. It means getting rid of all of the things that could affect or undermine establishing a very strong correlation between a change and an effect. And so the lab is also necessarily having to do a work of decontextualization in order to do that. And so to me, this optical rationality shared between the prison and the laboratory vision. It's not accidental that this is that they complement each other in very specific ways. And again, it's not accidental because we see this in the longer history of medical science in the United States, the exploitation of captive people. And so at the end of the day, I was trying to make this argument about expediency and how that is how the lab works. This is something that STS folks have written about, that oftentimes in the lab, researchers work not because they're trying to find truth or they found a fact, but they have objects that allow the work to continue. And so I see that also in the prisons. This is about it's an institution that sort of reproduces itself. It has all of these ways of explaining the intent behind that reproduction, but I was trying to just simply look at what it's doing and not what it says it's doing for society, for example.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that because I think that came through so well in the book. And as someone who's done some time in art history, I felt like there was this beautiful formal analysis of the prison and the lab. And you did such a wonderful job of walking us through these various points of meeting or congruence between these sites that we might think of as very distinct. And I think your point about de-individualization, repetition is such a good one. But I had a question for you following on that about actually history itself, right? Because I do get the point that like it repeats, right?
Yeah.
But it's also specific. And so I had a question about the specificity of this historical moment. You know, the phrase you use in the book is, you know, the collapse between the object of study and the plane of vision itself. And I think it's so evocative of exactly what happened, right? So it's like the object actually becomes, right? Skin becomes actually the screen by which we understood race, or at least Kligman understood race. But during the time, at least the early part of his experimentation, which was like 50s, early 60s, that wasn't really the era of mass incarceration yet, right? So the prisons looked a lot different than they do now, right?
Yes.
And it's a mixed race prison. And it is it just isn't. And actually Holmesburg is one of those prisons that was written about poetically as like a kind of a model, right?
Yes. Yes.
For its symmetry and its beauty, all of that, right? And so, and of course, Kligman himself, right? He didn't really start working on Black population and thinking about these until a little bit later in his experimentation, right? It didn't even occur to him. But your point about it's not about bad science, it's about the way that race is already infused, right? And race thinking absolutely infused his work, whether or not he was working on Black populations, right? But something changes in his plane of vision, right? It shifts. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how the historical context outside of the prison lab, given that the prison's not impervious to what's going on outside in terms of race making, right? That might actually have shifted how Kligman actually saw race inside the prison.
Could you just say a little bit more about how his perspective shifted?
Or it might have framed the way that he changed the way he saw race inside the prison, right? For instance, I was just thinking about the way that it was not a big, sort of like variable for him in the beginning. And then it becomes a big variable. And then he really leans into it, right?
Yeah,
So what happens and what's happening outside the prison that might explain that shift, if you want to speculate or think about
what's happening,
both the ways in which this repeats and also the ways in which it's very specific to different historical moments.
I see. So his initial studies weren't about race for sure, and his studies on tretinoin, for example, he was trying to develop a skin lightening solution. He preferentially used Black prisoners for that, not because he was trying to model Black skin as hyperpigmentation problems in the white subjects for which that treatment was developed, but simply because he found Black skin very good for showing color contrast. And so it wasn't at all about race. And here I make the argument that skin or race itself is being done. It's not being talked about. It's not the object of study. It's not being, looked at in any explicit ways. It's just, it defines the captive body in Black skin as expedient for certain kinds of visualization. But you're right, his perspective then shifts. And it shifts because when he wanted to study pain, when he wanted to study skin allergies, all of a sudden, Black skin was a terrible instrument for that, according to him and his researchers in the lab, because their definition of pain on the skin, of skin allergies at the time, their metric for seeing it was pink or redness, which is difficult to see in darker skin. And his solution for that was to then dial up the concentration or the dosage of treatments, of test subjects, to sort of to increase pain in order to better see pain in Black subjects. And so there he concluded that it would be preferable to use white prisoners for this study, but Holmesburg's prison population at the time was above 80% Black men, and so his own research environment did not help him produce the kind of procedures he wanted to. Outside of that, outside of those experiments, he was interested at looking at weak allergens in common household goods. And so we're seeing, one, the rise of pharmaceuticals, increasing interest in cosmetics, and he coined the term cosmeceuticals. A lot of what we know about sun damage and skin, Kligman's work contributed to that. And so, and of course, outside of the prison, and what he was responding to is war. And so in the prison, his vision of skin changes again, and he starts experimenting on things that I guess on this we could say he had no business experimenting with. Psychopharmaceuticals, for example. I mean, he wasn't a psychologist, he wasn't a psychiatrist. So what is he doing? Experimenting with psychopharmaceuticals that could be used against prisoners of war. He's a dermatologist. And so this was also very difficult for me to explain, like, why is he doing that? Like, and I didn't want to simply say, oh, he is being a dilettante, right? This is again another example of a scientist getting too big for his breeches, of, this is where science went wrong. I didn't want to go there again. And so I returned to this idea of skin in this context not mattering in the way, not mattering as skin. What was more important was that he had a prison population he could do anything to, and that is whether to contribute to dermatology, to find, to develop new cosmetics, or to contribute to war efforts.
Yeah, and one of the most surprising turns in your book, for me at least, was how you explain that so breathlessly and impressively, and then turn to popular culture, and then turn to art making, and show us that the impact and the legacy is happening in other places, not just within the confines of science or the pharmaceutical companies, or but really trying to think about that chapter on skin as architecture is fascinating, because you resurrect something that really I had suppressed. I mean, that I watched Ghost Stalkers, that you had brought something like that up, and ruined photography. And I'm just wondering about your process by which that chapter is so poetic about how you talk about this ruined prison as a site of death and decay, trash, but it has such a fertile site of the imagination, and about what the consequences are of this era of captivity in science, but its implications beyond. And can you tell us a little bit more about your process here, about how you came to pull these things together and imagine them within a way of talking about the boundaries between art and scientific representation and popular culture?
Yes, so that was a chapter I resisted in writing, only because, like Stuart Hall, I don't really care about pop culture. But however, trying to be, again, a good researcher, I wanted the objects to come to me and speak, right? There is a reason why Holmesburg is such a well-worn site, and pop culture is one of the reasons why. It's not just an instance of medical abuse, but it's also a place where a lot of ghost stories were created. It's a place for movies in Hollywood and things like that. And artists have engaged with this space. And so that was an instance where I went to the prison. I visited it several times myself, and I had this intention in mind that when I go in, I am going to see a laboratory, right? I'm going to see that, and I show up, and there is garbage everywhere, peeling paint, bird shit all over the place. I have to sign this form saying that if I get cancer from the asbestos or I get sick from the lead exposure, I'm not going to sue the city, right? It's all of these things kind of unraveled this argument, or this image I was so ready to see, right? I'm going to see a laboratory. So the turn to pop culture was a way to engage in a space that didn't give me what I wanted. How to talk about science, not through the language of experts this time, but through the language of pop culture, of artists, of aesthetics. And here, the question isn't about producing knowledge anymore. It's about producing memory. How do we remember this space? It's producing experience. How do we experience this space when we're in it? And so that was another way for me. I feel like this project was always trying to take me out of STS. Away from the scientists, and I'm just like, no, I can't write myself out of my own field. But yeah, it was my choice of archives, and the analysis that the book adopts is simply me being open to letting go of an archive and letting others come to the foreground in its place.
Cristina, I love that. I love the fact that this is your journey into thinking about memory and experience and what it means to let go of the archive. I think that's really extraordinary for all of us as we work through our projects in different ways. I want to open it up now to questions from the audience. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. And I see a lot of friends and colleagues here, and I'm sure you have a range of different questions. So feel free to raise your Zoom hand, and I'll call on you. We can keep the conversation going. Don't be shy. Yes. Lynn.
Hi, this is a softball just to warm us up, right? So thank you so much for your comments and for the conversation. I'm thinking about, so I'm building off of Thuy's question, which I think was, obviously as somebody who does like Southeast Asian American studies, thinking about the Cold War and Thuy's book and how she shows that Kligman's work, it begins by, as a war dermatologist studying these diseases that result from war in Asia, and thinking about how, so one is like a question that I don't have, I don't know what the answer is, but it would be great to answer. So it's not really a question. And then the second one actually is a question. So the first one is, if your question, Thuy, was like, what is kind of enduring and what is different? And so thinking about like Kligman's, he ends up at, as you show, he ends up at black skin because they, what Cristina said, right? They can't see the visual effects of like injury or pain because it doesn't turn pink the way that white skin does. And then so they develop this theory that like it must be like superhuman somehow. And so it becomes strong, and then it becomes the site of experimentation because it has these characteristics that white skin just don't have. And so the question of like what is different and what is enduring, that's a question that I have, because I think that one thing that you do really well, Cristina, is you don't just say like this is the afterlife of this, right? And I think that drawing the straight line is not the answer, right? But then like, what is different, and I don't know what the answer is to that question. But the real question is, I think like there's something wonderful that you do when you talk about whether it's expediency or utility. It's really the ability to be used in these different kinds of ways that makes Blackness so useful for these dermatologists. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I see in what you're doing, and I'm excited about it, like these theories that kind of relate to forward to your projects about trauma. Like, how do we talk about the mundane, right? How do we talk about, you call it like, what we can't see, right? Or it's a non-spectacle, and these kinds of forms of everyday violence, which you're really trying to show us are the foundations of science. How is kind of utility an example of that? And like, what are some other examples? Or, can you talk a little bit about kind of the mundaneness and the utility that and that racial violence really is enacted through, that we're trained not to see?
Thank you for that question, Lynn. Yeah, well, what brought Kligman to the prison were fungal infections that some of the prisoners had. And that it was Kligman's specialization, actually, fungal infections. And he, among other dermatologists at the time, were studying fungal infections, how they affected American soldiers fighting in tropical areas during this times. And of course, we also see, this wasn't Kligman's work, but at the same time, a lot of research on malaria for this same reason. So a lot of public-private research for the war during this time. And the war also has a way of spectacularizing what is actually pretty mundane. And we see war in some ways as exceptional rather than as the logical conclusion of violations that are happening all the time. And so, yes, you're right about that. So I wasn't trying to sort of write this historiography of medical science abuses. It was this, how do we approach this as just normal science, which is the term that it's Thomas Kuhn. Again, it's very much entrenched, well known in science and technology studies. I wanted to sort of combine those two frameworks of thinking about the banality of exploiting expedient bodies, right? This is normal science. War and all the science that goes into it would also be normal science. Did I answer your question, address your comment? But yeah, so basically, what does visuality look like in that context? Because there's, it seems we know what it is when it's a spectacle, right? But when it's not, it's different. Yeah.
I'm going to turn now to Kuhn.
Thank you. And so I'm a postdoc at the Society Fellows in the Humanities and Comparative Literature. And I work on racial Blackness in modern China. And I have a question. Wow. And I found your work so fascinating and relevant. I haven't finished reading the whole book, but I definitely I'm reading up and just learning from so much from your research. So I'm starting a small little new project on the Chinese Medical Aid Archive from Africa. And wow. So from those archive, I'm kind of also just tracing the racialization of Black bodies through this medical documentation. And I would love to hear your thoughts. So maybe you talked about this in the book and I haven't come across it, but how's your approach to kind of I don't know if this is relevant to your research, but the transmediality of medical documentation, because from what I'm seeing in my own archival materials, so of course the visual aspect is very central to it, and we talk about the optical rationality of scientific racism, but at the same time there's a lot of writing and like other forms of documentation, and I kind of wonder how you approach this, and yeah, just any insights. Thank you.
Yeah, though that's a good question. That's a good question, because the last chapter of the book does kind of wrestle, like, how do I talk about the visuality when I'm working with this text at this point? So I was looking at the regulations that the first Bioethics Task Force, the National Commission, recommended in response to experiments on captive populations. And the easiest way to do it was one to look for very, very detailed descriptions where they're trying to sort of build an image of the object in your head. That's a kind of visuality. It's very, very descriptive, right? So that's like an easy way, but that wasn't happening for me with the Bioethics Commission, because there was their writing, it's policy, it's very dry, it's not evocative of images at all. So for me, I did the theoretical legwork of relocating skin in the language of bioethics, theorizing it as a form of skin, because bioethics does begin with a wounded subject. And they made all kinds of comparisons. One of the comparisons made was prisoners, like really bored housewives who just wanted to get more money, so they're going to join an experiment, right? So that was very interesting to me, this comparison being made, that it was always sort of deferring the question of captivity, that they had to analogize in order to even image or have an idea of a wounded subject. But for your work, I would suggest, wow, I'm terrible with names now after 2020, but there's this wonderful book about image texts. My visual culture folks in the room, I don't know if you remember. Let me see, I have my book here.
You cited on page 153, 54. It was really brilliant.
Mitchell, yes.
Okay.
W.J.T. Mitchell's work on image text, where he is trying to develop a theory of visuality using text, but also respecting, not collapsing image with text, also respecting the specificities of the two.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Sarah.
Hi. Oh, let me put that down. Thank you. This is a really enjoyable end of the semester life of the mind at a time that doesn't always give that. Thank you so much. I haven't read the book. I teach in the writing program, so I'm very interested in what you were just saying about writing, but I wanted to go back to something earlier that really struck me as somebody who does not specifically work in these fields, but is really interested in them. Kind of in response to one of the questions, you were talking about how you wanted to see a lab, and then you went there and it was so incredibly chaotic, and everything is falling down and contaminated. And that really connected back to what you were saying earlier about the way that these projects were described by the scientists involved as, it's a perfectly controlled setting, we can do perfect science here. And I haven't spent a lot of time in prisons, but I have friends who run prison education programs, and it was so interesting to me listening to your account of what the scientists thought they could get in prisons, because for my friends who go to prisons regularly, it's like impossible to plan anything. It's like so chaotic, like, oh, they're on lockdown. Oh, somebody's in solitary confinement. Somebody got in a fight. Somebody's having a bad mood, and you just can't, it just seems like a very chaotic environment, to get to the point. So when I was listening to the fantasy of the science that could be done there, and also the idea of what you were saying about, like, I'm going to go see a lab. So I guess the question is, fantasy an important term here? I'm interested in the way that the fantasy of science and that's like it's a controlled activity, and the fantasy of a prison as this is a place that contributes order to science. Seemed to me as, which it's absolutely not, as you illustrate and we all know, but it seems to me that part of what you're saying is that those two fantasy, it's not just that the science and the prison build to each other, but the fantasy of order is mutually constitutive between these two systems. And I guess I just wanted to ask if that fantasy life is, if I'm getting that right from you as an expert who knows more than me, and how that plays in.
Oh, thank you for that. Now I wish I had used fantasy, because that was so, well, yes, a fantasy of order, but I did not use fantasy. But you're right, they had an idea of a controlled setting, but most of the science was messy. It wasn't, precisely because it was a fantasy. It was a projection of the lab in a space that was not as ordered as they hoped it would be, but it was, you're right, the science that came out of there, as Alan Hornblum also wrote, was not tight. And so what knowledge was produced is an open question.
I think we're done now for questions, unfortunately. I know there's so much energy and enthusiasm here. I'm going to turn it over to Daniela.
I am so sorry. There's so much more to keep talking about, and I will save my question about visual culture for another time. But sadly, we are out of time. Thank you all for joining us. I do want to mention that the Levan Institute's next book chat will take place on January 22nd in the new year, where we will discuss Jonathan Leal's Dreams in Double Time on Race, Freedom, and Bebop. For today, thank you so much to our co-organizers, the Institute for Diversity and Empowerment at Annenberg and the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. Thank you so much to Professors Tu and Hatch for joining us, for their questions and discussion. Thank you, Nayan, for moderating. And above all, thank you, Cristina, and many congratulations on this fascinating book. It has been really a treat to learn more about it. Many congratulations.